A cold, damp night in the year 1762, the wind howls outside a lone tavern on a desolate road in colonial Maryland. Inside, a fire crackles, casting long shadows across a room filled with travelers seeking warmth and refuge from the storm. But tonight, there's something different about the Bleakmoor Tavern. The air is thick with a silence that's heavier than the falling snow, and the faces of the patrons are pale, their eyes wide with a shared, unspoken terror. They sit at their tables, but their mugs remain untouched, their food uneaten. They've come for shelter, yes, but they're not drinking ale, they're drinking in a story, a chilling legend whispered from one to another. What could possibly have held these weary souls so captivated, so paralyzed by fear, that even the lure of a warm fire and a full mug couldn't break the spell? It's a tale of a secret, a mystery that has haunted these woods for centuries. Hey everyone, if you're ready to dive into this story with us, be sure to hit that like button. And if you're new here, do you and forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you don't miss any of our upcoming journeys into the strange and unknown. It helps the channel out a ton, and we appreciate your support. The year is 1762. The place, a forgotten stretch of road in rural Maryland. The air, thick and heavy with the promise of a winter storm. It's the kind of night where the world outside seems to press in, a monochrome canvas of bare trees and biting cold. For any weary traveler, the sight of a flickering lamplight in the distance would be a welcome beacon. That's exactly what the Bleakmoor Tavern was, a humble wooden structure promising warmth, a mug of ale, and a brief reprieve from the harsh realities of the American frontier. And on this particular night, the tavern was busy, not with boisterous laughter or the clinking of mugs, but with a quiet procession of people. They arrived in twos and threes, their faces etched with the strain of a long journey, their clothes dusted with snow. A traveling merchant with a nervous twitch, a stern-faced woman clutching a worn Bible, a couple of trappers whose eyes darted around the room like startled birds. They came from different paths, yet they all seemed to share a common destination, this solitary tavern, and a strange sense of anticipation that hung in the air. The innkeeper, a grizzled man named Elias, moved among them, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He'd seen all types of people pass through his doors, but there was something different about this group. They weren't just seeking shelter, they were seeking something else entirely. There was a peculiar silence in the room, a low hum of unspoken questions. It was as if they were all waiting for a curtain to rise, for a show to begin. As the last traveler, a young man with a quill and a journal tucked under his arm, shuffled through the door, the storm outside truly began. The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to speak of distant sorrow. It rattled the windows and sent a shiver through the room, drawing everyone's attention to the fire blazing in the hearth. A natural focal point, it drew them closer, like moths to a flame. And it was around this fire that the story began. The young man, the one with the journal, cleared his throat. His name, he said, was Thomas. He had traveled far, drawn not by the promise of commerce or a new life, but by a story he had heard whispered in the taverns of Boston and Philadelphia. A story so strange, so unsettling, that he felt compelled to see its setting for himself. The other travelers, sensing his purpose, leaned in. Their eyes, once guarded and wary, were now wide with an almost desperate curiosity. So, he began. They say, he started, his voice a low rumble that cut through the storm's noise, that the Bleakmoor Tavern isn't just a place of rest, but a stage for something unexplainable. The others shifted in their seats, their mugs of ale now forgotten. The merchant's hand, once reaching for his drink, froze midair. The stern woman's Bible was closed and laid on the table. They weren't drinking ale. They were drinking in his every word. The firelight danced on their faces, highlighting their rapt attention. They were a captive audience, and Thomas was their willing storyteller. He spoke of the tavern's history, of its founder, a recluse named Jeremiah Bleakmoor, who was rumored to have built the place on a site with a dark past. He didn't offer a full story, not yet. He merely laid out the breadcrumbs, hinting at the strange events that had taken place here. He spoke of whispers, of cold spots, and of the land itself seeming to hold a secret. His words were like a kindling, sparking a fire of shared experience among the travelers. One by one, they began to share their own strange sightings, the odd feelings they had on the road leading to the tavern, a shimmering figure glimpsed in the woods, a voice calling their name on the wind, a sudden, oppressive feeling of dread that had no source. It was as if they had all been led here by an invisible force, a force that was now preparing to reveal itself. The silence that followed was not one of confusion, but of shared understanding. They had all felt it, they had all sensed it. The Bleakmoor Tavern wasn't just a shelter from the storm, it was the very eye of it. And as the storm outside raged on, so did the growing sense of suspense within the walls of the tavern. What could possibly have happened here to leave such an indelible mark? What was the story that had drawn them all to this remote corner of the world? Thomas, sensing the perfect moment, leaned back, a small, knowing smile on his face. He wasn't going to give them the answer just yet. He was going to make them wait for it. He let the silence stretch, the only sound being the crackling fire and the drumming rain against the windows. And in that quiet, heavy moment, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air settled over the room. The silence hung in the air, thick as the falling snow outside. Thomas had set the hook perfectly, and now, it was time to reel them in. He took a sip of water, a slight theatrical pause that held everyone's attention. The firelight flickered, making the shadows dance, and for a moment, it felt less like a cozy tavern and more like a theatrical stage. Then, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The legend of the Bleakmoor Tavern isn't about ghosts," he began, surprising them all. "At least, not in the way you might think. It's about a man, a bargain, and a curse that wasn't meant for him alone." A collective breath was held. The others had been expecting a ghost story, a simple tale of spectral figures and things that go bump in the night. This was something different, something more insidious. "His name was Elias Bleakmoor," Thomas said, naming the man who had built this very tavern. "He was a man who came to these woods with grand dreams and a hollow purse. He had a vision, a thriving inn on this very road, a bustling hub for travelers." Thomas paused, his eyes sweeping the quiet, tense faces around him. But this land, this very spot, it was not his to have. He explained that local tribes had long warned against settling here. Speaking of a restless spirit tied to the earth itself, they called it the Hollow, a presence that fed not on fear, but on something far more personal, ambition. But Elias Bleakmoor, a man of the Enlightenment and a disbeliever in such superstitions, pressed on. He cleared the trees, laid the foundation, and even used some of the ancient stones from a forgotten burial mound to build the tavern's hearth. It was then, Thomas explained, that the bargain was struck not with the devil, or a demon from below, he clarified, but with the land itself. With the Hollow, Elias, in his desperation for success, began to experience a stroke of unearthly luck. His crops flourished in the rocky soil. Travelers, drawn by an inexplicable pull, began to arrive in droves. His tavern became the most talked-about stop for miles. He had everything he had ever wanted, but as we all know, true bargains always have a hidden cost. The price, Thomas revealed, was the stories. As Elias's fortune grew, his patrons would sit around the fire, just as they were now, and share tales. But not of their travels, or their families, or their hopes. They would share their deepest, darkest secrets, their regrets, their fears. They would spill their souls, as if compelled by an invisible force, until there was nothing left but a shell of a person. And what happened to these people? Thomas's eyes held a grim answer. He didn't say it aloud, but the implication was clear. They would leave the tavern forever changed, their joy and ambition drained out of them, leaving them empty. And where did these stories go? A quiet voice from the corner asked, breaking the spell. It was the stern-faced woman. Thomas turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "They say the stories didn't just disappear. They say the Hollow consumed them, absorbed them into the very foundation of this building." He gestured to the floorboards, the stone hearth. "Every brick, every piece of wood. It's been infused with the whispers of broken dreams and shattered lives." The merchant shuddered, pulling his cloak tighter around him. The trappers exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated fear. The woman with the Bible clutched her book tighter, as if it were a shield. They were no longer simply listening to a story. They were a part of it. They were in the very room where these strange, dark confessions had taken place, sitting by the very fire that had illuminated the faces of those who had given up their souls. And as Thomas spoke, the room felt different. The air grew colder. The fire seemed to burn with less warmth, and a subtle rustling sound, like the turning of a page, could be heard from the shadows. The travelers' mugs remained untouched, their ale now a forgotten luxury. They were no longer thirsty for a drink, but for the truth. What was the fate of Elias Bleakmoor, and why had they, strangers from different walks of life, all been drawn to this one, isolated tavern, on a stormy night? He wasn't going to tell them just yet. He let the tension build, letting the silence once again fill the space between his words and the answer they desperately sought. It was a masterful performance, and a chilling one at that. The night deepens, and the storm outside seems to mirror the growing unease inside the tavern. Thomas, our storyteller, holds us all in the palm of his hand, his words weaving a web of folklore and dread. He's no longer just a traveler. He's a vessel for the tale, a man who has clearly done his research. To understand what happened here, he says, his voice low and deliberate, you have to understand the woods around us. He explains that these woods were, for generations, considered sacred ground by the native tribes who lived here, not in a celebratory way, but in a way that commanded respect and distance. They were a place of transition, a liminal space where the veil between worlds was thin. It was a place where ancient spirits resided, not malevolent, but watchful and easily disturbed. The tribes had a name for the phenomenon Thomas had called the Hollow. They called it Isquita, a word that translates roughly to the soul drinker. The soul drinker, Thomas elaborated, was not a monster with teeth and claws, but a presence that fed on human stories and memories. It was an entity that was drawn to ambition and greed, seeing them as a form of sustenance. And Elias Bleakmoor, in his blind ambition, had unknowingly built his tavern on top of the Hollow's lair, disrupting its ancient, slumbering state. But it wasn't just the stories that were the price. Thomas revealed a new, more unsettling detail. Elias, in his quest for riches, had been told by a local healer that his success would only last as long as his bargain held. The Hollow needed a constant supply of new stories. And so, Elias began to secretly sabotage his own business, to ensure that the stream of travelers never ran dry. He'd spread false rumors of treasure, of a shortcut through the woods, or of a magical spring nearby, anything to lure people to his tavern. The woman with the Bible, her face pale, spoke up again. "And what happened to him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did he escape this terrible bargain?" Thomas shook his head slowly, a grim look on his face. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "He didn't escape. They say the Hollow grew tired of the lies, of the fabricated stories. It wanted something more, something genuine." He then shared the final, tragic piece of Elias Bleakmoor's story. The Hollow turned on him, demanding his own story, not just a secret, but a complete chronicle of his life, his regrets, his loves, and his failures. And as he spoke, the Hollow consumed him, his memories draining from him like water from a sieve. He was found the next morning by his wife, sitting by the hearth, a blank look on his face, his eyes devoid of all emotion. His body was there, but his soul was gone. The room was now a tomb of shared fear. The merchant was visibly shaking. The trappers were clutching their rifles as if they could ward off an invisible threat. We, the audience, were no longer just hearing a story. We were feeling its presence. Was it just a story? Or was the Hollow still here, still hungry, listening to the very words being spoken? The thought sent a jolt of cold dread through the room, and as the storm outside seemed to reach its peak, a new sound cut through the noise of the wind and rain. A knock on the tavern door. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. Everyone froze, their eyes darting to the door. No one moved. Elias, the innkeeper, was the only one who seemed to have the presence of mind to act. He slowly, deliberately, began to walk toward the door. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden floorboards was deafening in the otherwise absolute silence. Who could be out there on a night like this? A night of terrible storms and terrifying stories. The answer was one they were not ready for, and one that would change the nature of this night forever. The 3 sharp knocks echoed in the silent tavern, a jarring intrusion into the world Thomas had so carefully built with his words. Every eye was on the door, every heart hammered against its ribs. Elias, the innkeeper, reached for the bolt, his hand hesitating for a moment. Who, or what, could possibly be out in this blizzard? He pulled the heavy bolt free, the sound a loud thunk that made a few people jump. As he swung the door open, a gust of wind and snow rushed in, momentarily blinding everyone. Standing on the threshold was a figure they hadn't seen before. It was a man, wrapped in a dark hooded cloak, with his face obscured by the shadow of his hood and a dusting of snow. He didn't speak. He simply stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him, sealing them all in once more. As he lowered his hood, they saw his face. It was old and lined, with a lifetime of stories etched into his skin. His eyes, however, were what truly held them captive. They were a startling, vibrant blue, and they seemed to hold an ancient sadness. "I apologize for the intrusion," the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But the storm is fierce. I saw the light and hoped to find shelter." His gaze swept over the silent, unblinking faces of the travelers, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. "You are not drinking." It wasn't a question, but a simple statement of fact. He looked at the untouched mugs, the uneaten food, and then his gaze landed on Thomas, our storyteller. "You are sharing a story, I see. A story of this place." Thomas, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. "We were," he stammered. "The legend of Elias Bleakmoor, and his bargain with the land." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "I know the story well," he said. "In fact, I'm the one who told it to him." The words hung in the air like a sudden, unexpected punch. The room became even quieter, if that was possible. The man who told Elias Bleakmoor his destiny? The very source of the curse? Who was this man, and what was he doing here now? The old man, sensing their collective shock, let out a weary sigh. He walked to the fire, warming his hands, and then turned back to face them. "My name is Silas," he began, "and I am keeper of tales." He explained that he was a descendant of the native tribes who had lived in these woods for centuries. His family was entrusted with the duty of warning others about the Hollow, the soul. He was the one who had tried to warn Elias Bleakmoor, but Elias, a man of progress and reason, had refused to listen. Silas, however, had never left. He had stayed a silent witness to the tragedy that had befallen Elias and his patrons. "I am here," he said, his voice dropping to an even lower register, "because the storm has brought us all here, just as it brought them here, and I am here to tell you. The story isn't over." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine, and I could see the fear mirrored on the faces of the others. We had all assumed the tale was in the past, a cautionary legend, but Silas was telling us it was an ongoing event. He wasn't just a guest, he was part of the play. "The Hollow is hungry," Silas said, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on each of us. "It has been sleeping, waiting for a night like this. A night when the storm is so powerful, it brings strangers from different worlds together. Strangers with stories, and it knows your stories now. It has been listening. The room was no longer just a tavern. It was a hunting ground. The mugs of ale felt like props in a deadly game. We weren't just a group of travelers sharing a night's rest. We were sacrifices, unknowingly brought to this place to feed a malevolent entity. Silas's arrival changed everything. The legend of the Bleakmoor Tavern was no longer a chilling story to pass the time. It was their reality, and the final, terrible twist, the true horror of the night, was just beginning to reveal itself. The shock of Silas's revelation hung in the air, a dense, suffocating blanket. We weren't just an audience. We were, as he said, a part of the story. The very reason we had all been drawn to this remote tavern on this stormy night now became terrifyingly clear. We weren't here by chance. We were here because the Hollow had called us. Silas, our new, unsettling guide, looked around the room, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. The story isn't about Elias anymore, he said, his voice a somber whisper. It's about the truth he tried to bury. He then explained that Elias Bleakmoor hadn't just used the land for his tavern. In his feverish ambition, he had discovered a hidden spring, one that didn't just provide water, but was said to have healing properties. It was a wellspring of positive energy, a place of peace and life that had been sacred to his people. Elias, seeing only profit, had covered it up, built his tavern directly over it, and sealed it with the very stones that were meant to honor it. In doing so, he had not only disturbed the land, but had actively turned a force of good into something malevolent. The Hollow, as Thomas had called it, was not a monster from outside. It was the life force of the land, corrupted and twisted by Elias's greed. It was a mirror of his own dark desires, and it fed on the same things that had consumed him: ambition, regret, and sorrow. By burying the good, he had created the evil. The stories you are compelled to tell, Silas explained, they are the Hollow's way of trying to free itself. It's trying to get you to remember what's been buried, to remember the life and joy that was taken. This new explanation was both a relief and a new kind of terror. The entity was not an evil force from beyond the grave. It was a perversion of life itself, a wound in the earth that was desperately trying to heal. But its methods were still terrifying. It was still feeding on people, still draining them of their emotional vitality, leaving them as empty as Elias Bleakmoor himself had become. So, what do we do? The merchant asked, his voice cracking with fear. How do we stop it? Silas looked at him, and for the first time, his eyes held a glimmer of hope. You tell the right story, he said simply. He explained that we were a diverse group, each of us carrying a unique tale of joy, of wonder, of hope. We were here, not as sacrifices, but as an antidote. We had to tell stories of our own choosing, not of regrets and sorrow, but of gratitude and joy. We had to remember the good in our lives, the moments of true, unadulterated happiness that we had forgotten in our rush to get somewhere, to be something. It was a strange, almost impossible request. In the middle of a raging storm, in a cursed tavern, we were being asked to share our most treasured memories, to give not of our regrets, but of our triumphs. But the fear in the room had been replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. They had all been on a journey, and they had all, in some small way, been running from something. Now, they were being asked to turn around and face it. Thomas, our original storyteller, was the first to begin. He didn't speak of the legendary curse anymore. He spoke of the first time he had ever held a quill, a young boy mesmerized by the magic of turning thoughts into words. The merchant spoke of the first time he had made a fair deal, one that was honest and brought joy to both parties. The woman with the Bible spoke of the day she had first truly understood the power of faith, not as a rule, but as a comfort. One by one, we all shared. And as we did, the room began to change. The air grew warmer, the fire burned brighter, and the sense of dread that had been a constant companion began to recede, replaced by a feeling of shared humanity and hope. The mugs of ale, once untouched, were now raised in a silent toast. We weren't drinking to forget, or to numb our fear. We were drinking to remember. The storm outside finally began to wane, its ferocious howls softening into a gentle rhythmic patter against the windows. But the real change wasn't outside, it was within the tavern. The air, once thick with tension and fear, was now filled with a quiet, palpable sense of peace. We had all shared our stories, not the ones of sorrow, but the ones of light. We had, in a way, healed the very wound in the earth that Elias Bleakmoor had created. Silas, the keeper of tales, watched us with a look of profound relief. The Hollow is not gone, he said, his voice soft. It is merely in slumber. But you have given it a memory of what it once was, a memory of joy. He explained that the old spirits of the land fed not just on pain, but on all emotions. Elias's greed had corrupted it, teaching it to crave only the dark stories. But our stories, our simple, honest tales of happiness and hope, had reminded it of its true nature. As the morning light began to filter through the tavern windows, the sense of unreality began to fade. The night had been a powerful, shared experience, a lesson in the power of stories. The travelers, who had arrived as strangers, now felt connected by a bond far deeper than a shared roof for the night. The merchant looked at his untouched mug, and a faint smile touched his lips. He finally took a sip, and it felt like a silent toast to the incredible night they had survived. The woman with the Bible opened her book and began to read a passage aloud, her voice a calm, soothing presence in the quiet room. The young man with the journal, Thomas, was scribbling furiously, not to capture the legend of Bleakmoor, but to document the amazing transformation they had all witnessed. This wasn't a story about a curse. It was a story about redemption. The tavern, Silas said, standing to face the fire one last time, will always be a place of stories. It is what it was built for. But now, it's up to you, the storytellers, to decide what kind of stories they will be. He gave a final, knowing nod, and then, as silently and mysteriously as he had arrived, he slipped out the door and into the fading light of the morning, leaving us to our thoughts. We left the Bleakmoor Tavern that morning, not with empty souls, but with full hearts. The journey ahead seemed less daunting, the road less lonely. We had been reminded that every person we meet carries a story, and that it is our choice whether to seek out the darkness or the light. The legend of the Bleakmoor Tavern isn't just a chilling tale to tell around a campfire. It's a reminder that the world around us is filled with stories, both good and bad. And it is a powerful truth that the stories we choose to share, the ones we choose to remember, have the power to shape not only our own lives, but the very world we live in. So, what story will you tell?